The desert sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Elena Castellano reached her position. The temperature hovered at -4 degrees Celsius, cold enough that her breath crystallized in small clouds she had to consciously suppress. Breathing created patterns. Patterns created visibility. Visibility meant death. She'd been moving for 6 hours through darkness so complete that the stars provided the only navigation. No night vision equipment, no GPS that could be tracked or intercepted. Just her eyes adjusted to the dark after 60 minutes of sitting motionless, and the terrain map she'd memorized 3 weeks earlier in a windowless room 2,000 miles away. The ridge she'd chosen offered a 360-degree view of the valley below. Behind her, more sand and rock stretching 20 miles to the nearest road. To the east, the oasis they'd be approaching in 72 hours. West, the abandoned compound that was officially their objective, but practically just another waypoint in an endless rotation of patrols through hostile territory. North, the Badlands where armed militia groups moved supplies and personnel through cave systems that predated the surveyors who'd first mapped this region. She knew every feature, every rock formation, every depression where rainwater collected once or twice a year and created brief explosions of desert vegetation. She'd studied satellite imagery until she could draw this landscape from memory, until she could predict where shadows would fall at every hour of every day, until she understood the terrain better than people who'd lived here their entire lives. Now she had to become part of it. The hide took 4 hours to construct. She dug 18 inches down, using a collapsible entrenching tool that made almost no sound against sand that was still cold and compact from the night. The excavated material went into sandbags she'd carried in her pack, arranged around the position to create a berm that would break her silhouette. Behind the position, a natural rock formation provided both structural support and thermal camouflage. By the time the sun rose, that rock would heat to nearly the same temperature as her body. Thermal imaging would see one warm signature, not two. She backed the hide with a camouflage net, then spent another hour gathering local sediment, sand from 50 meters north, dirt from 100 meters east, small rocks from the formation behind her. She dusted everything, blending the manufactured materials with the natural surroundings until even she had difficulty distinguishing where the hide ended and the desert began. She'd brought 16 liters of water in multiple bladders. 8 liters she kept at the primary position. The other 8 she'd cached in 4 locations during her approach march, buried in waterproof containers marked with GPS, coordinates she'd memorized and then deleted. If the primary position was compromised, she'd have fallback supplies. Planning wasn't about best-case scenarios. It was about surviving when everything went wrong. The rifle was already zeroed, but she'd test it anyway. At sunrise, when the first thermal currents began rising and the light was still low enough that muzzle flash would be difficult to see, she'd fire 3 rounds, one at 600 meters, one at 740, one at 800. Then she'd police the brass, bury it 2 feet down where metal detectors wouldn't easily find it, and settle into absolute stillness. That was day -3. Day -2 began at 0530 with the test shots. She'd selected targets carefully, rock faces that would show impact clearly but wouldn't hold marks long. The first round struck exactly where she'd aimed, 62 centimeters high and 15 centimeters right of the point of aim. Elevation and windage corrections made. The second shot hit center. The third shot hit center. She buried the brass casings in 3 separate locations, each hole dug to 60 centimeters depth. Deep enough that casual searches wouldn't find them. Deep enough that wind wouldn't expose them. She marked each location mentally, committing the precise coordinates to memory in case recovery became necessary. But not so deep that recovery would be impossible if she needed to police the entire position later. Then came the stillness. People who hadn't done this work didn't understand what stillness meant. They thought it meant sitting quietly, maybe not moving much. But operational stillness was something different, something that required rewiring the nervous system's basic responses. Her body wanted to shift position every 20 minutes, wanted to stretch muscles that cramped from maintaining the same posture, wanted to scratch itches that crawled across her skin like insects. Her mind wanted to wander, to think about anything except the task, to escape the crushing boredom of watching empty desert where nothing moved except heat shimmer and the occasional bird. She denied all of it. Every 2 hours, she allowed herself a position shift. Minimal movement, just enough to prevent permanent damage. She'd learned that lesson the hard way during training when a candidate had remained so motionless for so long that he'd developed compartment syndrome in his left leg. They'd evacuated him. He never returned to the program. The program, observer program, classified above top secret, compartmented into cells so isolated that most observers never met each other. She'd been Observer 7 for 6 years now. Before that, she'd been Lieutenant Elena Castellano, Marine Corps Scout Sniper. 3 deployments, 17 confirmed kills, recommended for the program by a superior officer who'd recognized something in her that she hadn't seen in herself: the ability to disappear. Day -1 was about learning the desert's rhythms. Wind patterns changed with the temperature. Morning brought steady currents from the east as cooler air moved toward warming sand. Afternoon created unpredictable gusts as superheated air rose and cooler air rushed in to replace it. Evening brought stillness, sometimes, or winds from the west as the temperature gradient reversed. She watched heat shimmer, learned how it bent light, how it created false images on the horizon, how it could make a man at 800 meters appear to float above the ground, or fragment into multiple shapes that merged and separated like living things. She watched birds, learned which species were native and which were passing through, learned their flight patterns, their alarm calls, the way they reacted to predators, to weather changes, to the presence of humans they couldn't see but somehow sensed. She watched the way sand moved. Wind created patterns, dunes that shifted overnight, ripples that flowed like water. But human passage created different patterns: compression marks, displacement that didn't match natural angles, disturbances that persisted longer than wind-driven changes. By the end of day -1, she could read this landscape the way people read books. She knew what belonged and what didn't, what was natural and what was intrusion. She was ready. Day 0 began 3 hours before dawn. She'd slept in 4-hour blocks, never more, never less. Longer than 4 hours and her alertness suffered. Shorter and exhaustion accumulated into dangerous levels. 4 hours was the balance. 4 hours had kept her alive for 6 years. She prepared her kit, rifle cleaned and oiled, scope lenses wiped with anti-fog solution, ammunition checked, 20 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 40 more in reserve. She wouldn't need half that. She never did. But preparation wasn't about what you needed. It was about what you couldn't predict. Protein bars. She hated them. They tasted like cardboard mixed with artificial sweetener and disappointment. But they provided calories without requiring cooking, without creating smells, without generating waste that needed disposal. She ate half a bar, drank exactly 400 milliliters of water, waited 30 minutes for digestion, urinated into a bottle that she'd empty later by pouring the liquid into the sand at the very back of the hide where it wouldn't create visible dampness. This was the reality of the work nobody talked about. The training montages skipped it. The legends didn't mention it. But this was 90% of being an observer. Managing biological functions. Enduring discomfort that would break most people. Accepting that glory and recognition were antithetical to survival. The patrol appeared on the horizon at 0845, exactly 15 minutes ahead of schedule. 11 personnel in a diamond formation, moving with good discipline through terrain that offered minimal cover. She tracked them through her scope. Magnification set to 12 power, enough to identify individuals, not enough to create tunnel vision. The point man was young, maybe 25. He favored his right side, carried his rifle at a slight angle that suggested an old shoulder injury. Good instincts, though. He scanned constantly, checked the ground ahead for disturbances, moved with the controlled aggression of someone who understood that hesitation killed, but recklessness killed faster. Behind him, the team leader. Older, mid-30s, she estimated. He moved differently than the point man. Less physical dominance, more situational awareness. He checked his team as often as he checked the terrain, made hand signals that were crisp and clear. This was someone who'd read the manuals and then forgotten them, absorbed the lessons into instinct. She zoomed in slightly on his vest. Name tape read, Holloway. Staff sergeant, based on the rank insignia barely visible under the dust and sun damage. First deployment to this sector, according to the briefing she'd received, but not first deployment overall. He had the bearing of someone who'd seen combat, who knew what mistakes looked like just before they killed people. Good. Good leaders kept their people alive. Her job was easier when leaders were competent. The rest of the team matched standard composition. Corporal Jameson Riley on point, Specialist Nate Brennan carrying the heavy weapon, an M249 squad automatic weapon that he handled with the casual competence of thousands of repetitions. Private First Class Marcus Dalton, serving as medic, slightly smaller than the others, moved with the careful precision of someone who knew he'd be needed when things went wrong. 7 others whose names she didn't know, whose faces she memorized anyway. Young men mostly, one woman carrying a radio that marked her as communications specialist. All of them sweating despite the early hour. All of them breathing harder than their physical condition warranted, because the heat here was a presence, a weight, a pressure that exhausted you just by existing. They reached the oasis at 9:40, 30 minutes behind her prediction, but still within acceptable parameters. The oasis was barely worthy of the name. Just a seep spring that created a patch of dampness 50 meters across, enough moisture to support some struggling vegetation and make the water table accessible if you dug down 2 feet. But in this desert, water was life. Water meant patrols stopped. Water meant they'd established a perimeter, filled their canteens, relaxed by fractions they didn't notice. Water meant vulnerability. Through her scope, she watched Holloway establish security. Good 360 coverage. Overlapping fields of fire. He put Brennan in the SAW in a position that could cover the most likely approach vectors. Put Riley on elevated ground with good sightlines. This was textbook small unit tactics, executed with a kind of precision that suggested regular training and strong NCO leadership. But textbook wasn't the same as adaptive. Predictable patterns were exploitable patterns, and 600 meters to her south, she'd been watching 3 men establish their own positions for the last 40 minutes. She'd spotted them through pattern recognition. The birds had given them away first. A pair of ravens that should have been roosting in the relative cool of morning had instead taken flight, circling, calling alarm. Birds didn't do that without reason. Then she'd seen the heat shimmer move wrong. Against the wind instead of with it. A thermal disturbance that suggested warm bodies in a location that should have been empty rock. Then sand falling at the wrong angle. Wind didn't create those patterns. Gravity was consistent. But a boot scuffing rock, dislodging particles, that created signatures that persisted. She'd found them. 3 positions, triangulated for crossfire. Classic ambush setup. 1 primary shooter, 1 secondary, 1 overwatcher who'd coordinate timing and call corrections. They were good, very good. Former military probably. Men who'd learned these skills in uniform and then used them for purposes the uniform wouldn't have authorized. The militia groups in this region were a strange mixture. Some were ideological extremists who believed the federal government was tyrannical and needed to be resisted. Others were opportunists who'd found that guns and willingness to use them could carve out small kingdoms in empty places. Most were something in between. Men who'd started with principles and ended with violence because violence was simpler than alternatives. She didn't judge them. Judgment wasn't her job. Her job was mathematics, range, wind, elevation, probability. Her job was keeping Holloway's patrol alive despite ambushes they didn't know existed. The primary shooter was settling in now. She could see him clearly at this distance, prone behind a rock formation that provided perfect cover and perfect shooting angle. His rifle was a Dragunov, Soviet-era design, still reliable, still accurate at the ranges he'd be shooting. He wore a sand-colored shamag that blended perfectly with the terrain. His breathing was controlled, trained. He was sighting in on Nate Brennan, who stood exposed near the water, rifle slung while he worked the filtration pump. She ran calculations, range to shooter, 612 meters via laser rangefinder, invisible pulse of infrared light that traveled there and back in microseconds. Wind, 3 knots from the west. She felt it on her face, watched dust devils spinning in the distance, checked the mirage in her scope, the way heat shimmer danced and bent, and calculated wind speed at various points along the bullet's path. Temperature, 41 degrees Celsius. Hot air was less dense. Less density meant less resistance. Bullets traveled slightly faster in hot air, dropped slightly less. Marginal differences, but at 600 meters, margins were life and death. Elevation, positive 43 meters. She was shooting downward at an angle. Gravity pulled perpendicular to the earth, not parallel to the bullet's path. Angular shooting reduced effective gravity along the bullet path, which meant less drop. She had to calculate the horizontal distance, not the true slant distance. Horizontal was approximately 608 meters. Bullet drop at 608 meters with .308 Winchester, 175 grain match-grade ammunition, in 41-degree heat, with the ballistic coefficient of her specific load, 81 centimeters. Wind drift at 3 knots across 608 meters, 15 centimeters right. She adjusted her scope. 8 clicks up for elevation, 2 clicks right for windage. Each click was 1/4 minute of angle. 4 clicks equaled 1 minute. 1 minute equaled approximately 1 inch at 100 yards. The mathematics were precise. The execution had to be more precise. Her finger found the trigger. She controlled her breathing. 4 counts in. Hold. 4 counts out. Her heartbeat slowed. Training and biochemistry working together. She fired between heartbeats. In the space where the pulse wasn't pushing blood through her body, wasn't creating micro movements that would disturb the rifle. She waited for the wind to pause, watched the mirage steady, felt the momentary stillness. She squeezed. The rifle's report was suppressed, reduced to a sound like hands clapping once, sharp but not overwhelming. The suppressor didn't make the rifle silent. That was movie nonsense. But it reduced the signature enough that direction became uncertain. Enough that distance became hard to judge. And then the wind gusted. Pure coincidence. A sudden blast that swept across the dunes and created a sound like distant thunder, a roar that swallowed the shot completely. 612 meters away, the militia shooter's rifle jerked violently. The bullet had struck the receiver, not the man. She'd aimed for the weapon deliberately, center mass of the rifle's action, where the bolt carrier and chamber met. The round punched through metal, shattered internal mechanisms, rendered the weapon inoperable. The man scrambled backward, confused and terrified. He looked at his rifle, destroyed in his hands. Looked at the sky, checking for drones. Looked at the rocks around him, searching for the source of fire that had somehow reached him from nowhere. He saw nothing. He signaled his partners and withdrew, moving fast, abandoning the ambush because a fighter with no rifle was just a target. At the oasis, Derek Holloway froze. He'd heard something. Not the shot. The wind had covered that. But the sound of metal fragmenting, sharp, distinct, wrong. "Weapons up," he ordered. "Possible contact." The patrol reacted instantly. 11 personnel spreading into defensive positions, scanning sectors, fingers on triggers. Brennan swung the SAW toward the most likely threat axis. Riley dropped prone behind cover with his rifle already shouldered, but there was nothing to see. The desert was empty. Heat shimmer danced. Wind blew. Somewhere a raven called. After 2 minutes of silence, Brennan spoke. Maybe the wind hit something. Debris from the old military range. Metal sheeting. Holloway didn't respond immediately. He was scanning, thinking, processing. He'd heard metal on metal. In the desert, metal meant human activity, meant weapons, equipment, vehicles. But metal at what distance? From what direction? The acoustics here were deceptive. Sound bounced off rock formations, bent around temperature gradients, created false impressions of origin and range. "Stay sharp," he finally said. "We move in 5. They finished the water break with weapons ready, but no attack came. When they moved out, their formation was tighter, their alertness heightened. Holloway kept checking his 6, kept scanning the ridgelines. He knew something had happened. He just didn't know what. Elena watched them go. She didn't move from her position. Movement after a shot was dangerous. It created disturbance. Better to remain absolutely still. Let the moment pass. Let questions fade into uncertainty. Nate Brennan was alive because she'd fired. He didn't know that. Would never know that. He'd go home to his fiancée in 6 months, marry her, start a family, live a life that had been seconds away from ending. His children would exist because of a shot he never heard. That was the work. She thought about Owen. She thought about him often, but especially at moments like this. Moments when the mission succeeded and nobody knew. When invisibility purchased survival and recognition would have meant failure. Lieutenant Owen Garrett, her spotter, her partner, her fiancé, though that had been against regulations and they'd kept it quiet. 29 years old when he died. 4 years ago now. 4 years that felt like both yesterday and a lifetime. New Mexico, border region, different desert but same mission. They've been tracking a militia weapons cache. Intelligence suggested anti-aircraft missiles, stolen from a National Guard armory 3 states away. Weapons that could bring down helicopters, civilian aircraft, create catastrophic casualties. They'd found the cache, called in the location, but protocol required target designation. Elena had used a laser designator to mark the exact building for the airstrike. Brief pulse of invisible infrared light, undetectable to human eyes but clearly visible to the sensors on the aircraft 10 miles away. The militia had night vision equipment. They'd seen the laser, triangulated the source, moved on the position with speed and violence that suggested military training. Owen had seen them coming, had pushed Elena behind cover, had returned fire to give her time to withdraw, had died buying her seconds that became minutes, that became survival. His last words, gasped through blood filling his lungs. "Elena, go dark. Stay dark forever. Don't let them see you. Promise me you'll never be seen again." She'd promised. "I won't, ever. I swear it." And she'd kept that promise. 6 years invisible. 6 years operating in the spaces between official operations. 6 years watching patrols survive because someone they didn't know was preventing the deaths they'd never know were coming. Some people might have called it penance. Some might have called it dedication. She called it keeping a promise to a man who'd loved her enough to die so she could live. The sun climbed toward its apex. Temperature rose from 41 to 43 to 45 degrees. The rock behind her position absorbed heat. By noon it would be too hot to touch, but it also radiated heat that matched her body temperature. Thermal imaging would see uniform warmth, no human signature emerging from the background. She drank 400 milliliters of water, ate half a protein bar, maintained hydration and nutrition at levels that would sustain cognitive function without creating excess waste. The hours passed. She watched the patrol move northeast toward the compound, watched them navigate terrain that looked flat but was actually rippled with subtle elevations and depressions that would be invisible until you were on top of them. Watched Holloway make good decisions and a few mediocre ones, and no catastrophically bad ones. They'd make it. Today, they'd make it. Afternoon brought weather changes. The winds shifted from steady to gusting. The sky took on a bronze tint that suggested a sandstorm was building somewhere to the southwest. Weather here turned fast. You could have clear skies 1 hour and zero visibility the next. She checked her equipment, ensured everything was secured. Sandstorms were miserable. Sand found every opening, invaded every mechanism. It clogged weapon actions, scratched optics, infiltrated electronics. But sandstorms also provided cover. Reduced visibility meant reduced threat ranges, meant attackers had to get close. Close was where she had absolute advantage. The storm hit at 15:30. The sky darkened from bronze to rust to brown. Wind gusted at 40 knots, strong enough to bend vegetation horizontal, strong enough to create a sound like sustained thunder. Visibility dropped from kilometers to meters in 20 minutes. Through her scope, she watched the patrol react. Holloway made the call immediately. Reaper 1-6 to all elements. Return to base. Stay together. Good decision. Trying to continue movement in zero visibility was how people got lost, separated, killed. Better to shelter, wait it out, maintain unit integrity. But staying together in a sandstorm was theory, not practice. The wind howled. Voices shouted from arm's length were ripped away. The patrol clustered close, linking equipment with lengths of paracord clipped to load-bearing vests. Even with physical tethers, shapes disappeared into the churning brown chaos. Elena lost visual contact within minutes. The storm reached her position, and her world became howling wind and stinging sand. She sealed her scope, covered her rifle's action with cloth, and relied on other senses. Sound. She listened through the baseline roar for variations, for voices, for movement, for the specific sounds that weapons made. Metal on metal, polymer stocks bumping against body armor, the distinctive click of safeties being switched off. She heard them at 1600. Multiple contacts moving through the storm with confidence that suggested intimate terrain knowledge. They were flanking the patrol's position, using the weather as cover, approaching from two sides. The mathematics of the ambush were elegant. Let the patrol shelter in the depression they'd chosen. Let them cluster for security, then attack from two directions with overwhelming firepower at ranges where visibility would be measured in single-digit meters. Point-blank massacre. Elena made a decision that broke protocols she'd followed for 6 years. The protocols were absolute. Never break cover, never fire warning shots, never acknowledge existence. Observers existed in the spaces between. Visible intervention meant compromised operational security, meant investigations, questions, exposure. But the protocols didn't account for 10 lives about to end in the next 3 minutes. She thought about Owen, about his promise, about 6 years of invisibility purchased with his death. Then she thought about Holloway's patrol, about Nate Brennan, who had a fiancé, about Marcus Dalton, who had a daughter, about men whose families deserved their survival more than she deserved her invisibility. She fired 3 rounds, spaced 5 seconds apart, into the sand 30 meters from the patrol's position. Not at targets, at empty ground. The sound carried despite the wind. 3 distinct cracks, evenly timed, deliberate. A pattern. Holloway heard them. Recognition was instant. 3 rounds, even spacing. That wasn't random. That wasn't natural. That was a signal. "Move!" he shouted. "Northeast, now." The patrol moved blind, stumbling through sand that felt like walking through water, trusting their compass, trusting their leader, trusting a warning from an unknown source. The militia reached the depression 3 minutes later. found it empty. They'd missed by minutes in meters. They withdrew, cursing the storm, cursing luck, not understanding that luck had a name and a rifle and a position they'd never find. Elena remained motionless after firing. Her hands were shaking slightly. 6 years of protocols broken. 6 years of invisibility compromised. Owen had asked her to stay dark. She'd fired 3 shots that announced her presence to anyone paying attention. But 10 men were alive. 10 men who would go home, who would see their families, who would age and laugh and live ordinary lives, purchased by her decision to prioritize mission over protocols. Owen, she whispered to the storm, I'm sorry. I broke the promise, but I think you'd understand. The storm cleared at 1800. Wind died as suddenly as it had begun. Visibility returned in stages. First 10 meters, then 50, then hundreds. The sun emerged from the dust, weak and diffused, casting long shadows across sand that had been reshaped by the wind. The patrol emerged from where they'd taken shelter, 2 kilometers from their original position. They'd used the storm's cover to break contact, to escape an ambush they'd never fully understood was coming. They were exhausted, disoriented, covered in sand that had found every possible opening in their gear, but alive, all 11, not even wounded. Holloway stared at the desert around them. His mind was working, processing, trying to make sense of anomalies. Sarge, Riley asked, what happened back there? Those sounds? I don't know, Holloway said, but someone, something, warned us. Weather, artillery impact somewhere on the old range, sonic boom from aircraft. Holloway didn't believe those explanations, but he had no better ones. The desert kept its secrets. At her position, Elena monitored their movement, watched them navigate back toward base, watched them maintain security despite exhaustion, watched them survive. She'd broken protocols. The question now was whether anyone would notice, whether the 3 shots would generate investigation, whether her invisibility was permanently compromised or just temporarily questioned. She'd find out, but that was future concern. Present concern was mission completion. The patrol still had 48 hours in hostile territory, still needed overwatch, still needed someone watching from positions they'd never see. She settled back into her scope, controlled her breathing, slowed her heartbeat, became invisible again. The sun set at 1930. Temperature plummeted from 45 degrees to 20 to near freezing in 3 hours. The desert's cruelty was consistent. It killed with heat during the day and cold at night. It demanded adaptation, endurance, suffering. She endured. She'd been doing it for 6 years. She'd do it for as long as the mission required. In the darkness, under stars so bright they cast shadows, Elena Castellano kept watch over men who didn't know she existed, kept promises to the dead while protecting the living, remained invisible while making sure others remained visible enough to go home. That was the work. That was the sacrifice. That was what it meant to be Observer 7. And tomorrow would bring new threats, new decisions, new questions about whether invisibility was worth the cost. But tonight, 10 men were alive. Tonight, that was enough. The brass casing caught the morning light like a signal flare. Derek Holloway knelt beside it, 300 meters from the oasis, alone in violation of buddy team protocols he'd enforce on anyone else. But this was personal. This was a mystery that had kept him awake through his last 2 watch shifts, calculating angles, reviewing memories, trying to understand what had saved his life. He'd returned at first light, using the excuse of equipment recovery to justify the solo patrol. The sandstorm had scattered gear, canteens, medical supplies, 1 dropped rifle magazine, all of it within acceptable parameters for a hasty withdrawal under 0 visibility. All of it recoverable. But he hadn't come for equipment. The casing was partially exposed, buried at an angle that suggested deliberate placement followed by natural disturbance. The sandstorm had shifted tons of sand. What had been buried 60 centimeters down was now 30 centimeters down. What had been invisible was now visible to someone who knew where to look. He photographed it in place, then extracted it carefully, like evidence from a crime scene, which in a sense it was. Evidence of a crime against invisibility, a mistake made by someone who otherwise made no mistakes. Federal gold medal, .308 Winchester. Match grade. The kind of ammunition that costs $3 per round. The kind that serious long-range shooters use when accuracy mattered more than economy. The brass showed minimal oxidation. 4 days old, maybe 5. Which meant it had been fired before the patrol even arrived. Before they'd received orders even. Someone had been here, establishing position, ranging targets, preparing. He checked the direction of fire based on the casing ejection pattern. Northwest ridge. He'd suspected that already from the acoustic signature of the destroyed rifle. Now he had confirmation. He marked the coordinates on his GPS, didn't transmit them. Some investigations required discretion that official channels didn't allow. The ridge was 800 meters distant, steep approach, rocky terrain that would show boot prints clearly. He didn't go there. Not yet. Going there would announce his investigation, would create evidence of his evidence gathering. Better to be patient, better to collect more data before committing to action that couldn't be undone. He pocketed the casing and headed back toward base, moving through morning heat that was already climbing toward 40 degrees. His mind worked the problem like a puzzle. One shooter, exceptional skill, no radio contact, no official presence, operating outside normal chains of command. Why? What motivated someone to provide protection while maintaining absolute anonymity? Duty? Dedication? Or something darker? Some psychological need that required this specific kind of isolation? He'd find out. Not because he wanted to compromise the Guardian's security, but because he needed to understand. Understanding was how you survived. Ignorance killed. 12 kilometers southeast, in a cave system that networked through bedrock like blood vessels through tissue, Rashid al-Mansour studied maps by flashlight. The maps were hand-drawn, updated constantly, marked with observations accumulated over 18 months of operations in this region. 18 months of watching federal patrols move through territory his group controlled. 18 months of calculated harassment. Not enough to trigger overwhelming response, but enough to make every patrol expensive, to exact the kind of steady toll that eroded political will over time. But lately the mathematics had changed. Sector 7 showed anomalous survival rates. Patrols that should have taken casualties returned intact. Ambushes that should have succeeded failed for reasons that defied analysis. 6 separate operations over 6 months, all failures, some catastrophic. That rifle destroyed at the Oasis had belonged to Ahmed, one of his best shooters, a man with 12 kills to his credit, a man who knew his craft. And someone had shot the rifle out of his hands from a distance Ahmed couldn't even estimate. Shot it without Ahmed ever seeing muzzle flash, without hearing report, without any indication of the shooter's position. "Ghost sniper," Rashid said quietly. His second, a younger man named Fared, looked up from weapon maintenance. "Federal Special Operations?" "Perhaps, but their special operations units operate in teams. Forward observers, spotters, security elements. This is one person, one exceptionally skilled person who operates entirely alone." "How do you know it's one person?" Rashid pointed to the map, to marked positions where inexplicable events had occurred. "The angles. If you calculate backward from the effects we've observed, all the shots originate from positions within a narrow corridor. One person moving between prepared positions. One person with extraordinary patience and skill." Fared frowned. "No one is that good." "Someone is, and to fight someone that good, I need someone equally exceptional." He'd made the call 7 days ago, shortly after the Oasis incident. Victor's arrival had been delayed by operational security protocols and border crossings. But the wait would be worth it. The man he'd contacted was legendary in certain circles, a specialist who understood that hunting hunters required specific skills that most snipers never developed. Viktor Kuznetsov arrived at 1400, driving a civilian pickup truck that looked like 1,000 other vehicles in the region. He was 52, but moved like someone younger. Lean, gray blonde hair cut short, eyes that scanned constantly but without apparent effort. The relaxed alertness of someone who'd spent decades in environments where inattention meant death. Rashid met him a mile from the cave entrance. They spoke in English, the common language of soldiers who'd learned their craft in multiple countries under multiple flags. "You said you had a problem," Victor said without preamble. "Federal ghost sniper, operating alone, extremely skilled. 6 months of operations against my forces. Zero contact, zero identification. My men are starting to believe she's supernatural." She? Assumption based on intuition, the patience, the absolute discipline, the preference for disabling shots over killing shots. Could be male, but my instinct says female. Victor considered this. "You have position data?" Rashid spread maps on the truck's hood, marked locations where anomalies had occurred. Here, here, here. 6 events. If you calculate reverse trajectories, they suggest northwest ridge positions with excellent observation. But we've searched those ridges, found nothing. You wouldn't. Someone operating at that level doesn't leave obvious signs. Victor studied the map, his finger tracing the terrain features. "What's your tactical objective?" "I want her neutralized, either killed or driven from the area. As long as she's active, my operations in Sector 7 are impossible." Neutralized, not captured, not identified? I'm realistic about probabilities. Someone with her skill level won't be captured. Identity is secondary to elimination. Victor nodded slowly. "My rate is 50,000. Half now, half on completion. Completion is defined as confirmed kill or permanent withdrawal from area of operations. I work alone. I don't follow your operational timeline. I'll require 4 weeks minimum, possibly 8. And if I determine she's beyond my capability to eliminate safely, I withdraw with no refund." Agreed. They shook hands. A transaction made between professionals who understood the rules of a game most people didn't know existed. Victor spent the next 4 days studying terrain. He moved methodically, never rushing, understanding that patience was the first requirement of counter-sniper work. He didn't search for the sniper directly. Instead, he searched for disturbances, ripples, the tiny imperfections that even the most disciplined operator couldn't completely eliminate. Rock faces showed almost imperceptible variations in thermal retention. Stone that had been in shadow from a human body warmed slightly slower than stone that hadn't been shaded. The difference was measurable only with thermal imaging equipment and careful observation, but it was measurable. Vegetation showed stress patterns. A plant growing near an occupied position would show marginally reduced growth on the side facing the position. Not from direct damage, but from altered light patterns, from carbon dioxide concentration, from microscopic changes in soil moisture where a human body had compressed the ground and altered drainage. Sand grain distribution told stories. Wind created specific patterns. Human presence disrupted those patterns in ways that persisted even after the presence was gone. The ratios of fine to coarse grains changed. The orientation of individual particles shifted. Reading these signs required experience most soldiers would never develop. Victor had developed them over 30 years. He'd hunted snipers in Afghanistan, in Syria, in half a dozen conflicts that never made headlines. He'd learned that the best way to find an invisible enemy was to stop looking for the enemy and start looking for the absence. The space where something should be but wasn't. The negative space that implied positive presence. On his 4th day of hunting, he found her first position, the hide near the oasis. It was masterwork. perfectly integrated with terrain, thermal camouflage that would defeat most sensors, sand and rock arrangement that created natural-looking formations covering manufactured structure. But the rock behind the position showed thermal stress patterns. And there, at the very edge of the hide, one plant showed asymmetric growth, and the sand grain ratios were wrong by fractions of a percent. She'd been here for multiple days, and she'd left traces so subtle that only another expert would recognize them as traces rather than natural variation. Victor smiled. This would be interesting. Elena was on day 11 since initial deployment, 8 days in her original hide near the oasis, 3 days relocating and establishing secondary positions after the sandstorm. The physical toll was accumulating faster than she'd anticipated. Her left knee had swollen to twice normal size. Bursitis from maintaining prone position hour after hour, day after day. The joint was hot to the touch, angry, demanding rest she couldn't provide. Moving from the primary position to this secondary location had been agony. Every step sent pain signals that made her vision blur momentarily. Her right shoulder had locked into sustained spasm. The muscles between her scapula and spine felt like knotted rope. She could still aim, still fire, still perform, but every movement sent pain signals that her brain had to consciously suppress. Dehydration was becoming problematic. She'd consumed 4 liters from her primary position. During the relocation after the sandstorm, she'd retrieved one of her cached water bladders, 4 more liters that had sustained her through the last 3 days. But that reserve was now down to 2 liters. At current rationing of 1 liter per day, she had 48 hours of water remaining. She knew the symptoms, had trained through them, knew she could maintain operational effectiveness for another 72 hours before extraction became medically necessary. After 72 hours, decision-making would be compromised. After 96 hours, she'd risk serious physiological damage. But the mission timeline was 72 more hours. Holloway's patrol had 3 more days in sector. She could last. She'd lasted longer before. The emotional toll was harder to quantify. 11 days of absolute solitude. 11 days of silence except for wind and distant sounds of patrols she monitored but never contacted. 11 days of thoughts that circled back to Owen, to New Mexico, to his blood on her hands while she tried to compress wounds that couldn't be compressed, to promises made to a dying man. The memory of New Mexico was always sharpest when she was in pain. Owen's blood on her hands, the laser designator that had revealed their position, his last gasping words about staying dark forever. She'd kept that promise for 6 years, until the sandstorm, until those 3 warning shots announced her existence to anyone paying attention. Had it been worth it? 10 lives saved versus 6 years of perfect invisibility destroyed. The mathematics seemed obvious. 10 lives, 10 futures, 10 families kept intact. Of course it was worth it. But Owen had died because she was visible, because a laser designator had revealed their position, because she'd chosen mission over security and he'd paid the price. And now she'd chosen mission over security again. The pattern worried her. The pattern suggested she hadn't learned the lesson his death should have taught. Her hand trembled during scope check. First time in 6 years. The tremor lasted less than a second, but she'd felt it. Muscle fatigue combining with psychological stress. Her body was telling her something she didn't want to hear. She ran her reset protocol. 4 counts inhale, 7 counts hold, 8 counts exhale. The breathing pattern activated parasympathetic nervous system response, vagal nerve stimulation. Heart rate decreased, muscle tension eased, vision cleared. Control. She was nothing but control. Emotion was exposure. Exposure was death. But part of her wondered if death might be simpler than this, than the endless watching, than the isolation that felt like drowning in slow motion, than the knowledge that she'd die eventually in some position like this one, and her body wouldn't be found for days or weeks, And the only legacy would be survival statistics that analysts couldn't explain. She pushed the thoughts away, focused on the mission. Holloway's patrol was approaching for their second deployment into sector. 2 weeks since the first patrol. Same route, similar timeline. Predictable. Too predictable. She scanned the terrain with new suspicion, searched for the ambush she knew had to be planned. Found it within minutes. Checkpoint Delta. Natural choke point where two rock formations created a passage barely wide enough for single-file movement. Perfect kill zone. But the ambush was too obvious, too visible. Rashid didn't make mistakes like that. He was too experienced, too careful, which meant the visible ambush was bait, meant to draw attention while the real threat came from elsewhere. She expanded her search pattern, scanned positions she'd normally ignore, and found him. Northeast Ridge, 840 meters, thermal signature barely distinguishable from surrounding rock. But there, present, a heat source that didn't match ambient temperature by 2 degrees. 2 degrees that meant human body in camouflage position. She ranged him, studied his hide, recognized immediately that this wasn't militia. This was professional. This was someone who understood counter-sniper operations. Someone hunting hunters. The realization sent adrenaline through her system. 6 years invisible, 6 years unopposed, and now someone who could see her. Someone actively searching for her position. She watched him through her scope, watched him scan methodically, watched his technique. He was searching in systematic grid pattern, overlapping coverage, using thermal imaging, using technique that suggested Soviet training. Spetsnaz, probably, or former Spetsnaz, now working freelance. His scope swept toward her position, passed over her once, twice. On the third pass, he stopped, adjusted magnification, focused. He'd seen something, some imperfection in her hide, some thermal variation or visual discontinuity that had triggered recognition. Their scopes locked. Two professionals recognizing each other across 840 meters. Neither fired. Holloway's patrol was between them. Shots would alert the patrol, would compromise both positions. Standoff. 90 seconds of absolute stillness, both calculating, both measuring advantage, both understanding that the next engagement would be lethal. Victor had elevation advantage. Uphill angle meant easier ballistics, less holdover, better thermal background. But Elena knew the terrain intimately, knew every rock, every shadow, every approach and withdrawal route. She had the defensive advantage. He had the offensive imperative. He needed to kill her or drive her away. She needed to survive and maintain mission. Different objectives created different mathematics. The patrol passed through safely, oblivious to the two apex predators watching each other over their heads. When the last soldier cleared the danger area, Victor withdrew first. Tactical admission that this engagement would happen later, under different circumstances, with different geometry. Elena remained in position. Her hands weren't trembling now. Fear had burned away into clarity. This changed everything. 6 years hunting from shadows. Now someone was hunting her. She thought about extraction, about calling in support, about requesting reassignment. All legitimate options given changed circumstances. But Holloway's patrol still needed protection, still faced threats she could prevent. The counter-sniper complicated the mission but didn't negate it. Mission first. Always mission first. Owen had taught her that, even if mission meant accepting risks that protocols said were unacceptable. She'd stay, she'd adapt, and if Victor came for her, she'd be ready. The third patrol deployment came 6 days later. Derek Holloway requested Sector 7 specifically. Unusual for patrol leaders to request sectors, usually command assigned based on rotation and operational requirements. But he'd submitted the request with justification. Geological survey work, terrain mapping, reasonable explanations that happened to require exactly the sector where the Guardian operated. Elena watched him arrive, watched him bring thermal scanning equipment, watched him conduct official survey work while actually running search patterns. He was looking for her. Not to expose her. She understood that instinctively. He was looking because he needed to understand. Needed to know who'd saved his life. She couldn't allow that. Being found meant being known. Known meant exposed. Exposed meant the work ended. She'd have to relocate, start over, learn new terrain, establish new positions, all while other patrols died because she wasn't there to prevent it. But she couldn't stop his investigation without revealing herself. Catch-22. Staying hidden meant allowing him to search. Stopping his search meant revealing she existed and proving his theory correct. She chose to stay hidden and hope his search came up empty. Hope that her craft was sufficient to remain invisible, even to someone actively looking. The attack came at 1500 on deployment day 2. 14 militia fighters against 10 patrol members. 3-to-1 odds, overwhelming firepower, coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously. Classic hammer and anvil. Drive the patrol into kill zone, eliminate with concentrated fire. Elena assessed the situation in seconds. Marcus Dalton was pinned, bleeding from leg wound, not arterial. But without treatment, shock would set in within 20 minutes. Nate Brennan was exposed, caught between 2 firing positions, minutes from being bracketed. Derek himself was targeted by militia sniper 620 meters south. Good position, good angle. Derek was suppressing enemy to his east and didn't see the threat from the south. 3 shots needed, 3 lives saved. But each shot would give Victor triangulation data. She'd seen him establish position at dawn, 840 meters northeast. Perfect counter-sniper location. He'd been waiting for this, waiting for her to reveal herself through action. The mathematics were brutal. First shot would narrow his search to 60-degree arc. Second shot would narrow to 15 degrees. Third shot would give him exact position. After her third shot, he'd have approximately 1.8 seconds to acquire her and fire before she could relocate. 1.8 seconds. Time for her to fire 3 shots and move. Not enough time to fire 3 shots, confirm effects, and move. She'd have to trust that her shots landed. Fire and move immediately. No confirmation, pure faith in skill. But if she didn't fire, 3 men died. If she did fire, she might die. Mission versus survival. The choice that defined every operator who'd ever done this work. She thought about Owen, about him pushing her behind cover, about him buying her survival with his death, about his last words, "Stay dark." But Owen had also taught her mission first, and the mission was keeping soldiers alive. She fired. Shot 1, target militia fighter pinning Brennan, 580 meters northeast, wind 2 knots west, temperature 43 degrees. She held 2 mils high, 1 mil right, squeezed. The round took him center mass. He dropped. Brennan scrambled to cover. Victor's scope swung 30 degrees toward her general area. He was ranging rocks, searching. Shot 2. Target militia overwatch targeting wounded Dalton, 640 meters east. Wind shifted to 3 knots. She compensated, fired, target eliminated. Dalton dragged to cover by Riley. Victor narrowed search to 15-degree arc. His scope was methodically checking every position within that arc. Shot 3. Target militia sniper about to fire on Derek. 620 meters south. Quartering wind. Difficult shot. She held 3 mils high, 2 mils right. Squeezed. The moment the rifle recoiled, she saw Victor's muzzle flash. She moved left. Pure instinct. 6 inches. The movement saved her life. Victor's bullet struck her scope instead of her head. The optic exploded. Glass and metal fragments erupted. One piece cut her left eyebrow. Blood streamed into her eye, hot and immediate. But she was alive. She rolled right, grabbed her rifle, abandoned the position in a low crawl that became a run the moment she was below the ridgeline. Rounds impacted behind her, Victor firing follow-up shots. But she was moving, and he was calculating for stationary target. She ran for 30 seconds, dove into pre-selected fallback position 300 meters west, assessed damage while adrenaline made her hands shake. Scope destroyed, primary optic system gone, backup iron sights functional but limited to 400 meters maximum effective range. Communication equipment damaged in hasty withdrawal, left eye swelling shut from the cut, blood everywhere. But alive. She was alive. And behind her, Holloway's patrol was extracting under covering fire, all personnel accounted for, casualties minor, mission successful. The cost was 6 years of invisibility gone in 3 shots. The benefit was 10 men going home to their families. She'd made the trade. She'd make it again. But Owen's promise was broken, and she couldn't unknow that. In the fading afternoon light, Elena Castellano began the painful process of relocating to secondary position. The hunter had become the hunted. The invisible guardian had been seen. And the mission continued because the mission always continued until you were dead or extracted. She chose to continue. Pain, exhaustion, compromised equipment, none of it mattered as much as the patrol that still needed 3 more days of overwatch. 3 more days. She could last. She'd lasted through worse. Behind her, Victor examined her abandoned position with professional respect. She'd been there multiple days. The hide was masterwork. The fields of fire were perfect. The escape route was pre-planned and executed flawlessly. He spoke into his radio. "Rashid, I found her. She's exceptional. This will take longer than expected." In the darkness, Elena settled into her secondary position with damaged equipment and bleeding wounds. She controlled her breathing, slowed her heart rate, became invisible again despite the pain, despite the fear, despite everything that screamed at her to extract and survive. Mission first. Always mission first. That was the promise that mattered more than invisibility. The promise she'd keep until it killed her. 12 hours after the firefight, Elena's secondary position looked like a field hospital run by someone who'd forgotten half their medical training. The left side of her face was crusted with dried blood she couldn't fully clean without wasting water. The eyebrow laceration had clotted but continued seeping when she moved. Her left eye had swollen to a narrow slit that provided maybe 30% normal vision. The destroyed scope sat beside her like an accusation. $12,000 of precision optics reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass. More importantly, it represented her primary capability. Without it, she was a long-range specialist without long range. A sniper effective to 400 meters instead of 800. Might as well be a regular infantryman with slightly better shooting skills. She'd spent the first hour of darkness constructing a field expedient replacement. Salvaged the ocular lens from the destroyed scope, mounted it in front of her backup iron sights using paracord and a section of PVC pipe from her repair kit. The result looked like something a child would build for science class, but it functioned. Barely. She'd tested it at dawn, 3 shots at known distances, 300 meters, 350, 400. The improvised scope held 0 within acceptable tolerances at 300, drifted 2 minutes left at 350, drifted 4 minutes left at 400, probably from the mounting system flexing under recoil. 400 meters maximum effective range, half her normal capability. She'd have to let threats get twice as close before engaging. Let them get close enough that counterfire became realistic probability instead of remote possibility. The tactical situation had degraded in other ways. Her primary hide was compromised. Victor knew exactly where she'd been. He'd be watching that position, and he'd be calculating where she might relocate based on terrain and mission requirements. Her invisibility was gone. She was now a known factor, a target being actively hunted. Protocol said, extract, call for pickup, report mission compromise, request reassignment or stand down pending threat assessment. Nobody would fault her for it. She'd been burned. The professional thing to do was withdraw and live to operate another day. But Derek Holloway's patrol had 68 hours remaining in sector. 68 hours of exposure. Without Overwatch, historical casualty rates said 2 to 3 KIA over that period. 2 to 3 men who'd go home in boxes because she'd chosen personal safety over mission completion. She couldn't do that. Wouldn't do that. Owen had died buying her survival, but he'd also taught her that the mission outlasted any individual operator. The mission was the thing. The mission was keeping soldiers alive, even when keeping them alive meant accepting risks that would make risk management officers write strongly worded memos. Her water situation was critical. She'd consumed the last liter from her current position at sunset. The cached water bladder she'd retrieved during the sandstorm aftermath was empty. She had perhaps 18 hours before severe cognitive impairment. After 36 hours, kidney damage became probable. After 48, she'd need medical evacuation or face permanent injury. But 68 hours meant she'd run out of water with 50 hours of mission remaining. 50 hours where she'd be operating with compromised judgment, reduced physical capability, and failing organs. The mathematics were unforgiving. She couldn't complete the mission without water. She couldn't get water without moving. Moving meant exposure. Exposure meant victor. She studied her maps. There was a seep spring 4 kilometers north. Barely a spring, really. Just moisture close enough to surface that digging 60 centimeters would yield collectible water. It would take 6 hours to reach, collect water, and return. 6 hours of movement, 6 hours of vulnerability, 6 hours where the patrol would be unwatched. Or she could extract, radio for pickup, be out in 2 hours, safe, alive, professional. She thought about Owen, about the night he died, about cradling his head while blood bubbled through his lips and he'd tried to talk through a punctured lung. Maybe Owen's dying wish had been born from fear, not wisdom. Maybe absolute invisibility was a cage, not armor. Maybe the promise itself had been wrong, asking for something that served grief more than mission. She made her decision. She'd stay. She'd manage the water crisis. She'd complete the mission with degraded equipment and compromised security. And if it killed her, at least she'd die doing the work that mattered, instead of living with the knowledge that she'd abandoned soldiers who trusted in protection they didn't know existed. Mission first. Even if mission first meant mission last. Even if the mission was the last thing she ever did. Night fell cold and absolute. Temperature dropped from 43 degrees to 18 degrees in 3 hours. Elena wore every layer she'd brought, and it wasn't enough. The cold was a living thing that found every gap in clothing, every moment of inattention, every weakness in physical condition, already degraded by 14 days of sustained operations. She monitored the patrol's night defensive position through her makeshift optics. They'd established good security, 360 coverage, overlapping fields of fire. Derek had them rotating 2-hour watches, which was aggressive but appropriate given threat level. He was learning, adapting. BCE, the kind of leader who brought his people home. At 0230, she heard it. The sound of metal on metal. Brief, controlled, distinct. The sound of someone checking their weapon, preparing for action. She activated night vision and scanned the sector where sound originated. 800 meters northeast. Nothing visible initially, then movement, thermal signature. Someone moving with extreme discipline toward a position that would overlook tomorrow morning's patrol route. She ranged the figure, 847 meters, beyond her current effective range. She could shoot, but probability of hit was maybe 40% with her damaged equipment. 40% chance of alerting a target to her position while failing to neutralize them. Unacceptable mathematics. She watched instead, waited. The figure settled into position, began the process of establishing a hide. This was militia setting up ambush for tomorrow. Patient, professional, deadly. She checked her maps. The patrol would pass that position at approximately 0700. Good light, long sight lines, perfect ambush geometry. If she did nothing, someone would die tomorrow, probably Derek himself. The ambush position had clear view of where the patrol leader would naturally position himself. She couldn't reach the spring and return before 0700. Couldn't reposition closer without alerting Victor, who was certainly monitoring her last known location. Couldn't engage effectively at this range with damaged equipment. She had one option, a night shot at 847 meters with improvised optics and degraded vision. The shot every instructor told you never to take. The shot where missing meant revealing your position for no gain. The shot that violated every protocol about engagement probability and risk management. She began calculating. Range 847, elevation -32 meters, downhill shot. Temperature 18 degrees, cold air, increased density, more resistance, bullets drop more and drift more. Wind was minimal, maybe 1 knot from the east. But night shooting meant she couldn't read mirage, couldn't see wind indicators, had to estimate based on feel and sound. Her damage scope could barely resolve the target at this distance. The improvised mounting system flexed. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, depth perception compromised. Her hands were cold, fine motor control reduced. Every factor was negative. Every calculation added uncertainty. The probability of success was maybe 20%. The probability of revealing her position was 100%. But the probability of Derek Holloway dying tomorrow if she did nothing was 90%. 20% chance of success versus 90% chance of his death. The mathematics were brutal, but clear. She settled into position, controlled her breathing despite the cold, slowed her heart rate through pure discipline, found the space between heartbeats where the rifle was perfectly still. She aimed for center mass of the thermal signature, held 8 mils high for distance in cold air density, held 1 mil right for the gentle east wind she felt more than measured. Squeezed. The rifle's report echoed off rock formations. Her suppressor reduced signature, but couldn't eliminate it completely. Sound carried for kilometers in the cold, still air of desert night. 847 meters away, the thermal signature collapsed and didn't move again. She'd hit. Somehow, with every factor against her, she'd hit. The 20% probability had resolved in her favor. Mathematics was probability, not certainty, and sometimes probability smiled. But now her position was announced. Anyone listening knew someone had fired from her general direction. Victor would hear, would recognize the sound signature, would begin calculating. She had perhaps 10 minutes before he maneuvered into position to return fire. 10 minutes to pack critical equipment and relocate. She moved fast, no longer worried about noise discipline. Grabbed rifle, ammunition, water bottles that were empty but still useful, and medical kit. Left everything else. The hide she'd spent hours constructing, the camouflage net, the sandbags, all of it abandoned for speed. She ran in darkness, using night vision and terrain knowledge to avoid obstacles. Ran until her lungs burned and her damaged knee screamed protest. Ran until she'd covered 500 meters and put terrain between herself and Victor's likely counterfire positions. Then she went to ground in a hasty position. No construction, no camouflage, just a depression behind rocks that offered cover and concealment. It would hold until dawn. After dawn, she'd need something better. Her radio activated. Priority message from command. Reaper 1-6, be advised. Infrared satellite detected heat signature at your projected 0700 route. Signature eliminated approximately 2 minutes ago. Source unknown. Derek's voice responded. Copy, command. We heard the shot. No visual on shooter. Copy, Reaper 1-6. Continue mission as planned. Be advised, unseen assets may be operating in your area. Unseen assets. Official acknowledgement wrapped in vague language that revealed nothing while confirming everything. Command knew something, suspected something, but wasn't sharing details that would compromise operational security. Elena allowed herself 30 seconds of satisfaction. The shot had worked. Derek would live through tomorrow. The mission continued. Then she checked her water supply. Zero. The empty bladders mocked her. The spring was now 6 kilometers away due to her relocation. The mission timeline was still 60 hours. The mathematics hadn't improved. She'd figure it out. She always figured it out. That was the job. Solve impossible problems with insufficient resources, while people who'd never know your name went home to families who'd never know how close they came to funerals. Dawn came at 06:15. Elena watched the patrol prepare for movement through her damaged scope. They looked tired. 2 weeks of desert operations wore on even well-conditioned soldiers. But they were alert, disciplined. Derek had them checking weapons, inspecting each other's gear, maintaining standards despite exhaustion. The patrol moved out at 0700 exactly, passing the position where militia ambush would have killed Derek if she hadn't fired that impossible shot 9 hours earlier. They never knew, would never know, would chalk it up to luck or intelligence that someone in an office had good information. That was fine. That was the work. Anonymous protection. Invisible guardianship. The kind of service that required you to accept that gratitude would never come because acknowledgement meant failure. But at 0930, something changed. Derek broke from the patrol, ordered them to establish security while he conducted personal reconnaissance. He was moving toward her former position, the compromised hide she'd abandoned 2 nights ago. Moving with purpose that suggested knowledge, not random searching. Elena watched through her scope as he reached the position, watched him examine the construction, the camouflage, the fields of fire. He was analyzing, understanding, putting pieces together. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled something from his pocket, the brass casing, the one she'd missed burying, the one the sandstorm had exposed. He held it up, examining it in the morning light. Then he started calculating. She could see it in his body language. He was sighting along the casing's direction, checking angles, doing the same geometric analysis she'd done 100 times, finding her pattern through pure deductive reasoning. He turned, looked directly toward her current position. Not at her, she was too well concealed, but toward the general area where logic and geometry said she had to be. He started walking, toward her. Elena's finger moved to her trigger, not threatening, just prepared. Her heart rate elevated despite discipline. She'd faced enemy fire without fear response. But this was different. This was being found, being known, being seen after 6 years of invisibility. Derek walked for 20 minutes, navigating terrain that should have been unfamiliar to him, but that he traversed with confidence born from study and determination. He reached a position 15 meters from her hide, stopped, spoke quietly. "I know you're here." Elena remained absolutely still. Every instinct screamed at her to relocate, to run, to preserve invisibility at any cost. But running would confirm his theory. Stillness might let doubt creep in, might make him question his calculations. Derek continued, "I've known for 3 days, worked out the mathematics, every shot, every angle, every save. One person, one exceptional person who's been protecting us since before we even received deployment orders." Still, she didn't move, barely breathed. Her rifle was steady, but her hands wanted to tremble. "I found this at the Oasis." He held up the brass casing. 4 days old when I recovered it. Federal gold medal. Match grade. You were established in position before we ever left base. You've been watching us for 17 days. 17 days. He'd calculated exactly. Impressive. 3 days pre-positioning, 14 days of patrol operations. His mathematics were perfect. "I don't need to see your face," Derek said. "Don't need your name. Don't need anything except I need you to know something. He paused. The desert wind filled the silence. Somewhere a bird called. My wife's name is Jennifer. We've been married 12 years. We have 2 daughters. Emma is 7. She wants to be a veterinarian. Sophie is 4. She's terrified of the dark but loves spiders. When I deployed, Sophie gave me her favorite stuffed rabbit, said it would keep me safe. I carry it in my pack. His voice cracked slightly. Nate Brennan is engaged to his high school sweetheart. They're getting married in October. Marcus Dalton has a daughter named Grace, 18 months old. He has pictures of her on his phone, shows them to anyone who look. Riley's mother is fighting breast cancer, stage 3. He's her only child. Elena felt something hot on her face, realized with shock that she was crying. Silent tears tracking through dust and dried blood. She was furious at herself for the emotional display, even though Derek couldn't see it. We go home to them because of you, Derek said. I don't know your story, don't know why you do this, but you gave us futures. You gave our families everything that matters. He knelt, placed something on a rock, something that caught the morning light. I'm leaving this here, not asking you to take it, not asking you to acknowledge, just so you know that someone sees you. Even if we never meet. He stood, turned, walked away without looking back. Elena waited until he'd traveled 100 meters. Then she used her scope to examine what he'd left. A military compass, old style, brass construction, engraved. She zoomed in on the engraving. To the Guardian, Reaper 1-6, Isaiah 6-8. She knew the reference, biblical passage. Here I am, send me. About volunteering for difficult service. About accepting missions others wouldn't. The tears came harder, silent, controlled, but harder. First emotional release in 6 years. First acknowledgement. First evidence that someone understood what she sacrificed, what she endured, what she chose every day, despite costs that accumulated into something that felt like drowning. Owen, she thought, I broke the promise. I let someone see me. Not my face, not my name, but my existence. Is that okay? Can I have that? Just being known? She didn't take the compass. Taking it would create evidence, would leave tracks. But she photographed it with her damaged camera, zoomed in on the engraving, saved the image to encrypted storage. Thank you, Derek Holloway, for seeing me without making me seen. The final day of the patrol deployment was the most dangerous. Extraction phase, open terrain, 2 kilometers to pickup point. Most vulnerable moment in any operation. The point where soldiers who'd survived everything else relaxed fractionally and died from threats they'd successfully avoided for days. Elena had relocated to a position with clear view of the extraction route, 420 meters from the pickup point, within her degraded equipment's effective range. It would have to be enough. Her water was gone. She'd consumed the last 200 milliliters at dawn. Her mouth felt like sandpaper. Her tongue was swollen. Her urine had been dark brown the last time she'd managed to produce any, which had been 6 hours ago. Her lips were split and bleeding. Her cognitive function was noticeably impaired. She'd caught herself making calculation errors. Simple arithmetic requiring conscious effort. That was bad. That was the beginning of serious deterioration. But the mission timeline was 8 hours. 8 more hours of coverage and the patrol would be extracted and she could radio for her own pickup. 8 hours. She'd lasted 68 hours with minimal water. She could last 8 more. She had to. Victor appeared at 0600. Thermal signature resolving into human form, 580 meters from the extraction point. Elevated position. Perfect angle on where Derek would naturally establish final security before boarding helicopters. Elena ranged him, 580 meters, just beyond her comfortable engagement range with damaged equipment, but within theoretical possibility, 40% hit probability, maybe 50 if she did everything perfectly. But she'd only get one shot. After she fired, Victor would know her exact position. He'd return fire immediately. At his range and with his equipment, his hit probability would be 80%, maybe 90. One shot to save Derek, then Victor would kill her. Those were the odds. Those were the stakes. She thought about extraction, about radioing for immediate pickup, about surviving to operate another day, about all the future patrols she could protect if she preserved herself now. Then she thought about Emma and Sophie Holloway, about a 7-year-old who wanted to be a veterinarian, about a 4-year-old who feared darkness but loved spiders, about daughters who deserved their father, about Jennifer who deserved her husband, about Grace Dalton who deserved to grow up knowing her dad. The choice wasn't really a choice. It had never been a choice. The moment she joined the Observer program, the moment she'd made that promise to Owen, the moment she'd accepted that some missions required everything, the choice was made. Mission first, even if mission first meant mission last. She checked her improvised scope one final time. Calculated range, wind, temperature, 580 meters, 2 knots west wind, morning temperature 28 degrees. Victor was prone, stable, perfect shooting position. His scope was steady on the extraction point, tracking the approach route. The patrol appeared at 0700, Derek in the lead, moving cautiously but necessarily toward the extraction point. They had no choice. Helicopter was scheduled for 0730. Miss the window and they'd be stranded until evening when temperatures would be lethal. Victor's finger moved to his trigger. Elena could see it through her scope, see the moment of final preparation, the breath control, the trigger press beginning. She had perhaps 2 seconds before he fired. 2 seconds to save Derek's life. 2 seconds to trade her invisibility, her safety, her future for his. She stood up. Full exposure. 6 feet tall silhouette on ridgeline against morning sky. The thing she'd sworn never to do. The thing Owen had died to prevent. The thing that meant Victor would kill her moments after she fired. But standing gave her stable shooting platform, gave her the best possible chance of making this shot at the absolute edge of her capability. Derek turned, saw her. Woman, late 30s, dark hair pulled back, left side of face crusted with blood, scar over left eye, rifle raised, expression of absolute determination. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. Recognition, understanding, gratitude, he couldn't speak. Then she moved, ran 15 meters laterally at full sprint, making herself difficult target, creating tracking problem for Victor, buying seconds. Victor swung his aim from Derek to her. She was the threat now, the target. She'd made herself visible. Invisible meant dead. She fired while running. Advanced technique, firing from movement. Accuracy degraded, but sometimes degraded was sufficient. Her bullet took Victor in the right shoulder, 6 inches left of heart. Not lethal, disabling. He dropped his rifle, fell back, hand clutching the wound. His shot, fired a fraction of a second after hers, missed by 4 inches. Passed between her arm and torso, close enough that she felt air displacement, close enough that different luck would have killed her. But she was alive. She rolled over the ridgeline, disappeared below sightline, ran 300 meters before going to ground. Behind her, Derek's patrol was extracting under covering fire. All personnel accounted for, 0 KIA. Mission successful. She'd broken every protocol, exposed herself completely, revealed her position, her methods, her existence. 6 years of perfect invisibility destroyed in 15 seconds of full visibility. But 11 men were boarding helicopters. 11 men were going home. Emma and Sophie Holloway would have their father at dinner tonight. Grace Dalton would grow up knowing her dad. Nate Brennan would marry his high school sweetheart in October. That was the trade. Invisibility for lives, safety for service, future for mission. Owen, she thought, I hope you understand. I hope breaking the promise was right. I hope you'd forgive me for choosing their survival over your dying wish. The radio crackled. All units be advised, Sector 7 extraction complete. Zero casualties. Repeat, zero casualties. Zero casualties. 92% survival rate maintained. Statistical anomaly. Unexplained success. Legend material. She radioed for her own extraction. Used emergency frequencies she hadn't activated in 6 years. Observer 7 to control. Mission complete. Request immediate extraction. Medical attention required. Equipment damaged. Position compromised. Time in field, 17 days. The response came from a voice she'd never heard. Classified frequency, special access channel. Copy, Observer 7. Extraction in progress. ETA 90 minutes. Your service is recognized. Your sacrifice is noted. Well done. 90 minutes. She could last 90 minutes. She'd lasted 17 days. 90 minutes was nothing. She settled into concealment and waited for pickup that would take her away from this desert where she'd lost her invisibility but found something else. Something about why the work mattered more than the recognition. About why some missions required everything and gave back only knowledge that you'd done what needed doing. 6 months later, Elena stood on a mountain ridgeline 2,000 miles from the desert. Different terrain, different climate, different sector, but same mission, same purpose, same quiet war fought in shadows by people whose names would never be known. Her left eye had healed, but vision was permanently reduced 20%. She'd adapted, trained with the limitation until it became part of her capability baseline rather than a deficit. Her knee still ached in cold weather. Probably always would. Small prices for 17 days in one position. She'd been debriefed extensively, had received medical treatment, had undergone psychological evaluation, where a doctor asked careful questions about isolation, stress, decision-making under pressure. She'd answered honestly, told them about breaking protocols, about choosing mission over safety, about standing fully exposed on that ridgeline. The evaluator's conclusion? Subject has achieved operational maturity. Trust when protocols serve mission and when mission supersedes protocols. Recommend continued deployment with promotion to senior observer. Senior observer meant training new candidates, meant passing on 6 years of experience to people who'd take her place when her body finally couldn't do the work anymore. Meant legacy beyond the statistics and the stories. But first, this mission, this patrol, this new group of soldiers who needed watching. Young Lieutenant Cole Hendricks, 24 years old, 1st Independent Command. She'd been observing for 4 days, watching him navigate terrain he didn't fully understand. With troops, he was still learning to lead. He made mistakes, small ones, the kind that would get him killed if left uncorrected. Her job was ensuring his mistakes didn't cost lives, that he survived long enough to learn from them. That was the mission. That was always the mission. Her radio crackled with his patrol's frequency. Command says Sector 7 maintained 92% survival rate for 18 consecutive months. Highest in department history. A soldier responded. The Guardian story, sir? The angel? Hendrix's voice was firm. Don't believe in angels, soldier. Believe in training, discipline, and vigilance. That's what keeps you alive. Elena smiled. Small, genuine. First real smile since Owen died 4 years ago. Good answer, Lieutenant. That's exactly how you survive. She reached into her chest pocket, pulled out a photograph, worn, creased, protected in waterproof sleeve. Derek's compass on a rock, the engraving visible. To the Guardian, Reaper 1-6, Isaiah 6-8. She looked at it for 5 seconds, her only memento of being acknowledged, of being seen. Then she put it back. She settled into her scope. New equipment, new sector, same purpose. Track the patrol moving through unfamiliar terrain. Owen, she thought, I kept your promise as long as I could. 6 years invisible. But missions required me to be seen. And I'd make the same choice again. Because invisibility without purpose is just hiding. And I wasn't hiding. I was protecting. Invisibility isn't about being forgotten. It's about being remembered in the survival of others. Every patrol that comes home. Every soldier who ages. Every daughter who keeps her father. Every son who knows his mother. Every family that stays whole. These are my monuments. They don't bear my name. They never will. But they exist because I existed in the moments that mattered. The desert kept some secrets. These mountains will keep others. The work continues in new places, with new faces. But the mission remains constant. Watch, wait, protect, remain invisible so others remain visible enough to live. That's the sacrifice. That's the choice. That's what it means to be Observer 7. And somewhere, in offices she'd never see, analysts studied statistics that defied explanation. Survival rates that shouldn't exist. Patrol outcomes that probability said were impossible. They'd write reports using words like anomalous and unexplained and requires further study. They'd never find explanations. The explanations were classified in files that required clearances most colonels would never achieve. The explanations were buried in mission reports that 3 people were authorized to read. The explanations were hidden in the spaces between official operations, where people like Elena Castellano did work that couldn't be acknowledged because acknowledgement meant it could no longer be done. But the soldiers knew. The ones who'd served in those sectors, the ones who'd survived when probability said they shouldn't. They told stories in quiet conversations about guardians who watched from nowhere, about shots fired by ghosts, about angels who protected without being seen. The stories weren't accurate, details were wrong, attribution was impossible, but the core truth was correct. Someone had watched over them. Someone had kept them alive. Someone had chosen their survival over personal recognition. That was enough. That was everything. That was the legacy that mattered more than names or awards or official acknowledgement. Elena adjusted her scope, tracked Lieutenant Hendricks in his patrol, calculated fields of fire, identified threat vectors, prepared to do what she'd done for 6 years, what she'd do until the work killed her or her body failed completely. The mission, always the mission. Everything else was secondary. In the cold mountain air, Observer 7 settled into position and became invisible again. Not because protocols demanded it, but because invisibility was the tool that accomplished the mission. And mission was all that mattered. Below, Lieutenant Hendricks's patrol moved through a valley they didn't know was being watched, moved through danger they'd never see, would go home to families who'd never know how close they came to grief. And Elena Castellano, Observer 7, settled into her eternal watch. Silent guardian, invisible protector, the price of their survival, paid willingly in the currency of absolute solitude. The work continued, silent, invisible, eternal, because some promises were more important than the promises we made. Some missions mattered more than personal safety. Some services required you to accept that the only reward would be knowing you'd done what needed doing. The scope was steady, the position was secure, the patrol was protected. And in that moment, that was everything.